come in, come in. Hello, hi, nice to see you, come on in. Oh, look, you find me just about to light what I can only describe as a truly hobbit-worthy pipe. It's an oak church warden whereby hangs a tail. Come and have a seat, let's just close the door behind you. Nice to see you again. I'm back from my American wanderings, but I'm about to set off again. This time to speak about George MacDonald. Let's just see how we go with this. It's only the second time I've lit it. Gosh, it's hard even to see where my flame is. Well, it's drawing very smoothly and beautifully. I've never had a church warden quite like this. This is almost worthy of the description of the pipe that Bilbo told Bilbo when he's standing smoking, it goes all the way down to the curly hair on his feet. But so this pipe came as a gift from a man called Jeff McFeeters, who's a fan of my writing, and who's particularly my book Word in the Wilderness. He liked and wanted to send me something. He says, this is a pear wood, no, it's not oak wood, it's pear wood. It's pear wood church warden pipe, made by Babinich smoking pipes in Ukraine. This is, of course, he writes, intended for use while reading Tolkien. I have a similar pipe, and smoking or just holding it gives me great joy. Well, lovely to think of it being made in Ukraine. One's heart is so often going out to the poor Ukrainian people, defending their liberty, as occasionally one is obliged to do. So, since he said it's a pipe for reading Tolkien, it's very good. It's, of course, the longer the stem. That's a nice one, put the stem through. The longer the stem, the cooler and sort of sweeter the smoke. So let's return to The Hobbit, and I thought it might be nice to go back to the very end. Funnily enough, the nearer it is, as it is near now, for me to pack my bags and set off on another of these adventures I seem to be having in my middle age, or after my middle age, rather like Bilbo, the more I cherish home, and sometimes really rather wish I wasn't about to leave it. So I thought it might be fun to read the very end of The Hobbit, Bilbo's homecoming, which is particularly sweet and poignant when you get to it, because there have been so many occasions when Bilbo's been in some narrow scrape or other that he wishes he was back in his own comfortable armchair with his pipe and the kettle just singing. So I'll read you this. It's also got yet another variation appropriate to its moment of Bilbo's immortal Road Goes Ever On song. So, as all things come to an end, even this story, a day came at last when they were in sight of the country where Bilbo had been born and bred, where the shapes of the land and of the trees were as well known to him as his hands and toes. Coming to a rise, he could see his own hill in the distance, and he stopped suddenly and said, roads go ever, ever on, over rock and under tree, by caves where never sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea, over snow by winter sown, and through the merry flowers of June, over grass and over stone, and under mountains in the moon. Roads go ever, ever on, under cloud and under star, yet feet that wandering have gone turn at last to home afar. Eyes that fire and sword have seen, and horror in the halls of stone, look at last on meadows green, and trees and hills they long have known. Gandalf looked at him. My dear Bilbo, he said, something is the matter with you. You are not the hobbit that you were. Of course, he's saying that with real approval. Actually, when you reread that poem, it touches on so many of their adventures, and the horror in the halls of stone, particularly. But here he is home again. And so they crossed the bridge and passed the mill by the river and came right back to Bilbo's own door. "Bless me! What's going on?" he cried. There was a great commotion, and people of all sorts, respectable and unrespectable, were thick around the door, and many were going in and out, and not even wiping their feet on the mat, as Bilbo noticed with annoyance. If he was surprised, they were more surprised still. He had arrived back in the middle of an auction. There was a large notice in black and red hung on the gate, stating that on June the 22nd, Messrs. Grubb, and Burrows would sell by auction the effects of the late Bilbo Baggins, Esquire, of Bag End Underhill, Hobbiton. Sale to commence at 10 o'clock sharp. It was now nearly lunchtime, and most of the things had already been sold, for various prices from next to nothing to old songs, as is not unusual at auctions. Bilbo's cousins, the Sackville Bagginses, were in fact busy measuring his rooms to see if their own furniture would fit. In short, Bilbo was presumed dead, and not everybody that said so was sorry to find the presumption wrong. The return of Mr. Bilbo Baggins created quite a disturbance, both under the hill and over the hill and across the water. It was a great deal more than a 9 days' wonder. The legal bother, indeed, lasted for years. It was quite a long time before Mr. Baggins was in fact admitted to be alive again. The people who had got specially good bargains at the sale took a good deal of convincing, and in the end, to save time, Bilbo's had to buy back quite a lot of his own furniture. Many of his silver spoons mysteriously disappeared and were never accounted for. Personally, he suspected the Sackville Bagginses. On their side, they never admitted that returned Baggins was genuine, and they were not on friendly terms with Bilbo ever after. They really had wanted to live in his nice hobbit hole so very much. It's very funny, the thing about wiping your feet on the doormat and the silver spoons. It's this return from high, perilous adventure of great epic and romance to the absolute domesticities of sort of suburban middle-class life. He's been dealing with these massive dragon hordes and mystical Arkenstones, and then he's back to the land of silver spoons, We have one or two inherited silver spoons. They're a thing of the past. But indeed, this is the bit I really relish. Indeed, Bilbo found he had lost more than the spoons. He had lost his reputation. It is true that forever after he remained an elf friend, and had the honour of dwarves, wizards, and all such folks as ever passed that way. But he was no longer quite respectable. He was in fact held by all the hobbits in the neighbourhood to be queer, except by his nephews and nieces on the Took side, and even they were not encouraged in their friendship by the elders. I'm sorry to say, he did not mind. He's not sorry to say that at all. He's delighted. And there's something very attractive about suddenly ceasing to be respectable when you're supposed to be respectably middle-aged. I'm sorry to say he did not mind. He was quite contented, and the sound of the kettle on his hearth was ever after more musical than it had been, even in the quiet days before the unexpected party. So you savour these things on return. His sword he hung over the mantelpiece. His coat of mail was arranged on a stand in the hall until he lent it to a museum. This is lovely. His gold and silver was largely spent in presents, both useful and extravagant, which to a certain extent accounts for the affection of his nephews and nieces. His magic ring he kept a great secret, for he chiefly used it when unpleasant callers came. And then, possibly one of my favourite sentences in The Hobbit is now to come. I really ought to have somebody inscribe it, in beautiful calligraphy, so I can put it up on my room somewhere. A great sentence, and here it is. He took to writing poetry and visiting elves. Visiting the elves, I think that's probably fairly true of me, that I've taken more and more to writing poetry, and although I'm not able to visit elves in quite the same way that Bilbo did, of course I visit them with Bilbo and with Frodo whenever I read The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, and I'm visiting them again in that I'm now writing the stuff about the upbringing of King Arthur when he didn't know he was going to be a king, when he was just a young foundling, a kind of fosterling. And one of the Middle English sources tells us that he spent time with the elves. So we don't know any of those stories at all, so I'm going to try and work out what they might have been. So I'm going to bring elves into my story of Arthur fairly shortly when I finally have the time to carry on writing it. So then he took to writing poetry and visiting the elves, and though many shook their heads and touched their foreheads and said, "Ah, poor old Baggins," and though few believed in any of his tales, he remained very happy to the end of his days, and those were extraordinarily long. So then we get a very nice addendum where Gandalf calls once more, and Balin, and we get a bit of a catch-up. And there's a very subtle contrast drawn, which he doesn't point, but it's really there, between Bilbo and the man who was the master of Dale, the village, the township on the lake. One autumn evening, some years afterwards, Bilbo was sitting in his study writing his memoir. He thought of calling them There and Back Again, a Hobbit's Holiday, when there was a ring at the door. It was Gandalf and a dwarf, and the dwarf was actually Balin. Come in," said Bilbo, and soon they were settled in chairs by the fire. If Balin noticed that Mr. Baggins' waistcoat was more extensive and had real gold buttons, Bilbo noticed that Balin's beard was several inches longer, and his jewelled belt was of great magnificence. They fell to talking of their times together, of course, and Bilbo asked how things were going in the lands of the mountain. It seemed they were going very well. Bard had rebuilt the town in Dale. Men had gathered to him from the lake and from the south and the west, and all the valley had become tilled and rich, and the desolation was now filled with birds and blossom in spring and fruit and feasting in autumn. And Lake Town was refounded and was more prosperous than ever, and much wealth went up and down the running river, and there was friendship in those parts between elves and dwarves and men. The old master had come to a bad end. Bard had given him much gold for the help of the lake people, but being of the kind that easily catches such disease, he fell under the dragon's sickness, and took most of the gold, and fled with it, and died of starvation in the waste, deserted by all his companions. The dragon fever, the hoarding and clutching to self. Now remember what we just heard about what Bilbo did with his gold, that he spent most of it on presents, useful and beautiful. The new master is of a wiser kind, said Balin, and very popular, for of course he gets most of the credit for the present prosperity. They're making songs which say that in his days the rivers run with gold. Ah, then the prophecies of the old songs have turned out to be true after a fashion, said Bilbo. Of course, said Gandalf, and why should they not prove true? Surely you don't disbelieve the prophecies because you had a hand in bringing them about yourself. That's brilliant. You may not notice a prophecy as being fulfilled because you are actually in your own work and action a part of its fulfillment. You get that all the time in the New Testament where they do or say something, or Jesus says something, and then suddenly it's like they had, and so the prophecy was fulfilled, but they didn't understand it at the time. All these things were coming true, and it's only when they look back, rather as Bilbo did, to write it down long afterwards, that they realised that they themselves were part of the fulfilment of prophecy. You don't really suppose, do you, said Gandalf, that all your adventures and escapes were managed by mere luck, just for your sole benefit? Ah, I see, so there was a providence at work. You're a very fine person, Mr. Baggins, and I'm very fond of you, but you are only quite a little fellow in a wide world, after all. Thank goodness, said Bilbo, laughing, and handed him the tobacco jar. The very the last two words of The Hobbit are tobacco jar. But again, you think of all these self-important persons who would be very upset if a wizard told them they weren't really that important after all, and you're only quite a little fellow in the wide world after all. Thank goodness, said Bilbo, and handed him the tobacco jar. That is wisdom right there. And we were all given it, to laugh at and enjoy and read and remember when we were 8 or 9. And hopefully some of us have remembered it and try to keep to that. So I'm very glad to share that with you. Unlike Bilbo, I'm not staying in my own little hobbit hole, but setting off on adventures again. But I'll be glad to greet you when I get back, and perhaps if we've time for a pipe or two, I'll hand you the tobacco jar. Thanks for calling round.